Hey, what's up? It's Anton Jackson, and for this video, I'm going to review the fourth episode of Season 5 of Better Call Saul entitled Namaste. Now, this video is going to be a little bit different because my video editing capabilities are absolute trash right now, meaning I can't edit at all. So basically, this is going to be one long, uncut review of me talking about this episode. So I apologize if there's awkward pauses, if I'm stumbling over my words, if there's a lot of ums and uhs and stuff like that. But this is all I got right now. I am hampered by time and by technology. And I thought, you know what, maybe this will be better than not doing a review at all. So again, I'd love to know what you guys think of this review if you watch it to the end. And I'm kind of stalling here because I don't really want to get into it because I'm kind of dubious about how this is going to turn out, but whatever. Let's jump right into it. Namaste, Episode 4, Season 5 of Better Call Saul. Okay, so, cold opening scene of this episode. We see Jimmy enter this sort of, antique store, a sort of thrift shop, if you will, and we don't really know what he's doing here. He seems to be looking for an assortment of different items in this shop. He does a sort of test where it looks like he's trying to see how easy it is to throw said objects that he's picking up. Again, when I'm watching this scene, I have no idea what's going on initially, as I suppose most people watching this show thought at the time. But anyway, after stumbling on an assortment of items, he finally comes up with these bowling balls that he wants to purchase. Again, not really sure what was going on in Jimmy's head at the time. But of course, by the end of the episode, it's totally revealed to us what the premise of this looking through the thrift shop is for Jimmy. Okay, so after this, the first act of this episode then picks up with Jimmy and Kim waking up, following them throwing the beer bottles into the street and them shattering all over the place. So basically, the premise of this scene here is after they sort of get up out of bed and then get ready to go to work, following their night of drinking, we then see them come across the glass and we see Kim sort of look uneasy about the shattered bottles all over the street. Jimmy tells Kim to not worry about it, how someone else will take care of it. Also tells her that he's going to take Howard up on that lunch offer that he offered him in the previous episode where he was kind of dismissive and didn't really want to, have anything to do with Howard at the time. But anyway, of course, following Jimmy going to work, we then see Kim, cleaning up the glass. Again, with the benefit of hindsight, this is sort of, again, showing the sort of constant struggle that I think is going through Kim's head with this wanting to act out versus having these sort of sets of morals that she has to live by. Again, at the time, like I've talked about in my other reviews, I kind of was wondering where is this going to go, but of course, with the benefit of hindsight, having seen all these episodes already, we know where the plot of Kim goes in the end. So yeah, that's just kind of the setup here of this very first scene in Act 1. Then following this, the next scene in this episode, we then see Jimmy with the two sort of, hoodlums. There's probably a better word than that. We see them that he's going to represent both of them following their absolutely drug-induced debauchery mayhem that had been going on previously prior to this. And anyway, the main premise of the scene here is, it's kind of interesting in my opinion without going into the specific details of the scene. What I find kind of interesting about this scene is that we can kind of see that these two characters are basically being used for sort of comic relief here in this episode. And I find that kind of interesting because, of course, in Breaking Bad, Saul was the comic relief sort of aspect compared to the sort of darker nature of Walter White. But now with Better Call Saul becoming a much more deep and complex backstory for Jimmy McGill, his character is becoming more serious and more sort of nuanced, and he's sort of becoming that serious Walter White character. So different characters are being inserted into the plot for this sort of comic relief aspect. And again, without going into specific details here of the scene, with the whole sort of 50% off and, Jimmy talking about him getting them the best deal. What I found the most interesting about this scene is that we really see Jimmy here act in a way I never really saw him act in the plot of Breaking Bad. I mean, we see him really sort of, almost angry, if you will. It's almost this sort of, machismo that he's putting out there. Again, I don't really know what's going on in Jimmy's head at this time, but this almost seems like a sort of, big shot act he's putting on here. Definitely feeling like, in my opinion, he seems like a character who has something to prove in this part of the series compared to Breaking Bad, where I feel like he was already sort of much more comfortable with who he was and sort of used more sarcasm and comedy when dealing with his clients. But here we can really see the sort of internal strife that I feel like Jimmy's going through in this scene, where we see him sort of really I feel like putting on an act almost, this sort of over-the-top I don't know, again, machismo sort of guy, the sort of persona I feel like he's putting on, sort of like having something to prove. But anyway, yeah, in the end, I guess his sort of act kind of scares these two characters straight, and it gets them to, go along with Jimmy's plan of having him represent them as opposed to the public defender. Okay, so following this, the next scene in this act, we then see Jimmy with Howard at the restaurant for their lunch. And again, a sort of continuation of the previous scene where, again, we see a very angry Jimmy here with Howard. And again, before we sort of break down the sort of personality that Jimmy's putting on here, the main premise of the scene is that Howard offers Jimmy a job at HHM, feeling that he should have done it in the past, and he regrets not hiring Jimmy when he first passed the bar. Of course, Jimmy, very dismissive here of Howard's offer, not really wanting to go work for HHM. Of course, other things going on in his mind. Of course, Howard has no idea to this point about the fact that Jimmy is dealing with the cartel, and he has all these other sort of things going on. Of course, this scene, a big piece of foreshadowing for where the plot of Jimmy and Howard goes throughout the course of this season. And of course, following this lunch where Jimmy sort of, somewhat alludes to, but dismissively and maybe not genuinely so, says he's going to go about and think about Howard's offer, we then see Howard sort of hug Jimmy and then drive away in his car, where we see the plate that reads Namaste. Now, interestingly about this scene, I was kind of reading on line on Reddit and things like that about whether or not, at the time this episode aired, whether or not this was genuine of Howard. And honestly, in my opinion, I think it was. I really feel like this scene, we see Howard trying to find this sort of inner peace, with all the things that have gone on in his life, with his business partner dying, with, the firm sort of going back and forth about whether or not it will be bankrupt and things of that nature. I really feel like he's trying to find some inner peace here in this scene. Of course, again, this scene will totally build up to where the plot Jimmy and Howard goes throughout the course of the season. But again, a very interesting piece of setup here in this scene between Jimmy and Howard. Really the first real scene of these two characters that we get to see in the plot of this season so far. Okay, then following this, Act 2 of this episode then picks up with Kim attending a meeting with Paige and Kevin regarding Mr. Acker and the Tucumcari dispute. In this scene, we see sort of Kim argue that maybe here we go, I'm stumbling here. Maybe Mr. Acker and Mesa Verde should, not build the call center on the spot where Mr. Acker lives. Not wanting to have this sort of reputational negative press that would maybe ensue from kicking an old man off his lawn. But of course, Kevin then tells Kim that this is his land, he lawfully bought it, he has the right to do it, and he doesn't want, this Mr. Acker to interfere with, him going about his business. So, again, Kim sort of reluctantly agrees to go with the plan, even though she's trying to sort of help Mr. Acker here in the scene. Again, this scene, a big piece of foreshadowing for where this plot goes throughout the course of this episode and beyond. Then following this, we then see the plot of Mike continue in this episode, in the scene following this, where we see Mike return to Stacy's house following the sort of whole ordeal that happened with Kaylee in the previous two episodes prior to this, where we see Mike kind of return to babysit Kaylee as if nothing happened. He apologizes for losing his temper at Kaylee, but of course Stacy says that Kaylee has already forgotten about the incident. Of course, she then tries to press Mike here and clearly knows that something's going on, and asks Mike what's going on. Of course, Mike being so emotionally sort of reserved and being a sort of person who doesn't want to talk about his emotions at all, sort of totally dismisses this notion by Stacy. Of course, just wanting to go about the babysitting routine as if nothing happened. But of course, Stacy tells Mike that, she best thinks he doesn't babysit Kaylee after what happens. Again, Mike, being horrible at communicating his emotions, kind of just frustratingly walks away in anger following the scene. Again, this scene, a total piece of foreshadowing in hindsight of where this plot of Mike ends in this episode. Okay, then following this, the next scene in this act then picks up with Kim walking into Bernalino County Courthouse, where we can see Jimmy arguing as a defense attorney for his client. Again, this scene, I can't really sum up how unbelievable the scene is. You just got to go back and rewatch it. This might have been one of my favorite scenes in the entire season of Better Call Saul. Again, long story long, we see Jimmy sort of go about this long ruse where he gets a mistrial to ensue. Again, I don't want to go into all the little details here. It could go on forever. I definitely recommend you go back and watch this scene again. Unbelievable scene where he gets a mistrial declared. I mean, just classic Saul Goodman, classic Jimmy McGill. Unbelievable scene. Of course, then following the revelation of a mistrial here, we then see Kim in the courtroom still when Jimmy returns following meeting with the judge in her chambers. Again, and then in the scene, before it cuts to black and we move to the next scene, we then see Kim ask Jimmy for a favor regarding the Tucumcari Carry case. Of course, again, another piece of foreshadowing here for where this plot goes following this act and beyond. Okay, then following this, the next act in this episode then picks up with Gus at Los Pollos Hermanos. Again, another unbelievable scene in this episode. Again, my explaining of it just can't do it justice. I mean, the back and forth with Gus and Lyle and cleaning the fryer, unbelievable scene. Anyway, this scene sort of culminates with the conclusion of the plot of Lalo trying to undermine Gus Fring for his uncle Hector. And again, long story long, we see Hank and Steve Gomez sort of fall right into Gus's trap where he's playing the long game here, and he knows he has to give up this money in the short term in order to play the long game against Lalo. Again, this scene is very long. There's so many details in this scene. I could go on forever by explaining it. But again, another unbelievable scene where we see the juxtaposition of the Gus and Lyle at Los Pollos Hermanos with him waiting for the phone call compared to what was going on with Hank and Steve Gomez. Unbelievable scene in my opinion. Again, Hank and Steve sort of fall for the ruse in the end. And of course, like I said, this scene where Gus has to give up this considerable amount of money is again a sort of, an ante that he is playing so that he can continue to play the long game against Lalo Salamanca here in this season. An unbelievable scene. Again, so many great scenes in this episode. It's one of my favorite episodes of the season. I'm not even joking. This was an unbelievable scene in an unbelievable episode. Then following this, the final act in this episode then picks up with Jimmy going to Mr. Acker's property in Tucumcari. Again, I feel like I'm saying it over and over again, but again, another amazing scene in this episode. We then see Jimmy going to Mr. Acker, claiming that he wants to represent him against Mesa Verde. Of course, Mr. Acker, completely dismissive, wants nothing to do with Jimmy initially, very skeptical, most likely after meeting with the Kim Wexler. But of course, Jimmy being very persistent, a man who never takes no for an answer the first 15 times, shows Mr. Acker his proposal, to which, following seeing the photo which Jimmy hands Mr. Acker, Jimmy says, "What do you see?" And of course he says, "A man effing a horse." I mean, unbelievable acting in this scene, just an unbelievable piece of comic relief. We get to see sort of Jimmy play both of these in this episode, more of the serious character, but here we get to see him sort of, as a little bit more comic relief here. Unbelievable. So, in the end, this sort of presentation that he gives to Mr. Acker works, and he agrees to represent. Mr. Acker agrees for Jimmy to represent him. Of course, after this, he calls Kim and tells him that it worked. the plan worked. He'll represent Mr. Accurate. Again, we don't really know what the main plot is here and what Kim's plan is yet. We'll find out in the future episode and beyond. Okay, of course, following this, we then see Jimmy driving his car to Howard's house, and then finally the payoff, we finally see what the premise of the bowling balls is, and basically it's just for Jimmy to sort of, be a dick to Howard. He basically takes these bowling balls and throws them over his gate and destroys his Jaguar. Again, Jimmy flees the scene, and then we then see Howard emerge from his balcony, just sort of flabbergasted and speechless that someone threw bowling balls in his yard and, destroyed his car. Then, following this, the very last scene in this episode, we then see Mike walking home from the bar like he did in the 2 episodes prior. Then, following this, we then see the same sort of hoodlums sort of attack him like they did a few nights previously. But of course, unlike previously where he was able to subdue the attackers, this time they get to Mike and they end up stabbing him. Of course, following the stab, Mike blacks out. And of course, for a split second, I'm like, oh shit, what's going to happen to Mike? But of course, with the backstory of Breaking Bad, we know nothing's going to happen to Mike. I mean, he can't die here because of the backstory of Breaking Bad. But of course, following him getting stabbed and him blacking out and the scene cutting to black, we then see him waking up in this new location, what it looks like the middle of nowhere. And of course, when he finally gets out of bed and he rolls outside, we see this sort of, this rural compound where it's implied that Mike's in Mexico. And of course, after watching the scene, in my head I was going, what the heck is this? Again, we know in the end Mike is going to turn out okay. But of course, this scene, a total setup for where the plot of Mike goes in the next episode, an extremely important episode where we finally see Mike sort of come to terms with his life and who he is, and we finally get to see the backstory of the sort of genesis of him becoming the man who works for Gus Fring in the plot of Breaking Bad. So yeah, that's basically the entire episode here. I mean, this episode was truly one of my favorite episodes of this season. Again, an unbelievable episode, so many great scenes. I feel like I'm just repeating myself here, but it's true. I mean, so much setup, setup for all these characters. Truly a great episode, and again, like I said, I really am running out of superlatives to say. So anyway, yeah, that's all I really got. This was kind of interesting, just me rambling on with no breaks here. Again, I'd love to know what you think, what you think of this review. But anyway, yeah, that's all I really got. So, yeah, that's all I got. Before I ramble on any further, I just want to say my name is Anton Jackson, and thank you again for watching.